Welcome to Heresy, the Horus Heresy talk show. In this video, we're going to be talking about how to equip your Deimos Predator. This is a January 2023 update from the original video that I did back in September when we didn't have both kits. We're going to be talking about what's changed since last time I spoke about the Predator. We're going to be going through all of the Predator weapon options, including the old ones and the new ones, loadout considerations, some recommended loadouts, the strengths and weaknesses of vehicles and why a Predator is worth considering for your army, and also some Predator tactics. But before we do that, if you do enjoy the content, please do like and subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to join us in Discord as well. The link to that is in the comments down below. And now, on with the show. So what's changed for the Predator? Well, the Deimos support tank released a couple of months ago, and that's completed the weapon options for the Predator, notably the turret weapon options, and there's some really good ones in the new support tank kit as well. So the autocannon is no longer the default absolute best choice. There's plenty of other turret options now that are all viable. There's some new armies that have gained ground as well. So Mechanicum had not long released last time we spoke about this, and obviously there's people running that army now. The Imperium Libra's come out, and that's brought some different armies as well, which has made some of the weapon choices a little bit better, notably the ones that have got AP4 and are more aimed at, clearing chaff infantry off the board, like heavy flamers, which the Predator can take a lot of. There's more easily available anti-marine units now as well, so again, Mechanicum gaining some prevalence. The Whirlwind Scorpius having come out in plastic is a big deal as well, as lots of people have got them now where there wasn't so many before. And the Predator's main competitor was heavy support squads. Putting 10 las cannons or 10 whatever in a heavy support squad was a super good option. But now that there's so many easily available and quite common ways to kill big units of Marines, heavy support squads are losing a little bit of ground in how good they are. And, it's a good thing to look at other options for how to bring heavy weapons to the table. Just in general, I think as well as the game's gone on and people have got a little bit more used to it, and maybe people are, playing different things and finding different ways to achieve things on the tabletop, I think anti-marine weapons are becoming a little bit more common. So, those Scorpiuses as well, but you're seeing people running more plasma and things like that. At least I am in, my local area in games that I look at. So there are more anti-marine options out there in general as well. So again, a little bit of a boon for vehicles that don't suffer from those things as much. Also, depending on your play group, I would say that because the game's been out for a while as well, there's some mixture of either a negative reaction towards dreadnoughts, or people trying not to bring as many dreadnoughts, or just people wanting to play something different than, sticking 3 or more dreadnoughts on the table all the time, has meant that people are looking for other ways quite often to put big guns in their army. So you still want to play your game, you still want to bring guns to kill your opponent's big stuff, but maybe you want to do it in a different way sometimes. And again, that varies on playgroup and where you play, but I definitely think that changes the landscape for the Predator. Let's take a look at the turret weapon options now. So the Predator autocannon, very cheap, obviously free, comes with the tank, really good weapon, great shots, good at killing armor, good at killing hard targets, not amazing at anything, but for its points, plenty good enough. Particularly good for Imperial Fists and Iron Warriors with the bonuses they get on it. Imperial Fists hitting more often, Iron Warriors also turning it into a much better anti-tank weapon with the rending and extra strength as well, but always worth considering on the tank just because of the price of it, and it does a reasonable job. The Flamestorm Cannon as well is a good new weapon that's come in the support kit, so it's not too expensive, 15 points. It's pretty good versus Auxilia and some Mechanicum units, also Scouts if you ever play against them, which you probably won't. It's gone up in value a little bit, this weapon. Now it's got things that can actually penetrate and kill, and particularly if you're playing Auxilia, lots of models on the table that it can take off very quickly. This is an interesting option to do that. It does get some benefit in Salamanders, so with the Wall of Death, the +1 strength isn't super helpful because it's already high enough strength. The Death Guard Alchem Cannon, very similarly. It's going to woo most things on a 2 anyway, so Fleshbane isn't necessarily helping. And really it's a side grade at best, because when you fire it on a 1, it's going to get hot and fail to fire as well. But this is an okay gun. It's not a fabulous gun, but it's certainly got a niche, and if you like the look of it or fancy playing with it, you can certainly make it work. Another new option is the Executioner Plasma Destroyer. So excellent anti-marine weapon, very big blast, rending, wounds on a 2. makes it quite a good alternative to the Scorpius. So the Scorpius is 25 points cheaper than a Predator with this, but this is in theory more accurate because the Scorpius is probably going to be firing from out of line of sight because it needs to stay alive and it can't move. So interesting sort of change of pace for a way to kill Marines. The only problem with this is it probably should have been Strength 8. I think Strength 7, given it's, a much bigger plasma gun, is a little bit lame. So it means you're not going to instant death Terminators, you're not going to ignore Feel No Pain, and the Scorpius is. So this is a good alternative to that. I wouldn't say it's better, it's probably a little bit worse. But, if you've already got one Scorpius in your army, you want something else, you don't want to spam them, or maybe you think the Scorpius is a little bit too good, which it maybe is, at Killer Marines, this is another good option to take. And, looks cool driving around the battlefield, shooting plasma and stuff as well. It is a little on the expensive side, though. It's not too expensive if you consider, the role it's going to fulfill. But obviously the tank is not the toughest thing in the world, so paying 25 points for a plasma destroyer can be quite hefty. I'd probably leave the las cannon sponsons at home on this one, so we'll talk about sponsons in a bit, but las cannons are generally a steal. You can definitely put them on this, but if you're going to be shooting plasma at Marines and probably not shooting at Terminators because you're not Strength 8, you're probably going to be targeting normal Marines with this, the las cannons are a little bit less worthwhile, so maybe consider leaving them off. The heavy conversion beam cannon is, like most conversion beam weapons, just generally too expensive. A bit hard to use, unfortunately. The ranges are too big, particularly when you're playing on a board with good terrain. More and more people are now, as people are discovering this is quite a shooting heavy game. You need terrain to make the game work and not make it too much of a shooting gallery. Some things that can make conversion beams work are like very hypermobile units, but the Predator isn't really that mobile or maneuverable because it's a vehicle as well to keep the optimal range. So not a great platform for the heavy conversion beam cannon. It's definitely usable if you want to sit your Predator at the back of the battlefield and have a cool looking turret, but I'd probably avoid this in favour of some of the other many good options that you've got, such as the Magnum Melter Cannon. Now this is 3 melter shots, Strength 8, AP1, Armor Bay and a half range, and it's got a 36-inch range. Now that's very high for a melter weapon, and obviously it means you get armor bay at 18 inches as well. And it's only 20 points. This is an excellent weapon. It's probably the best turret weapon on the Predator. It's really good versus armor. It's enough shots to be worth shooting into things like Terminators as well. 3 shots, good chance of getting a kill, maybe 2, with instant death against them as well. Generally just a fantastic weapon, so I would highly recommend using this, whether you a sort of melter-focused legion or not. They look cool regardless. Big melter shots are always awesome, and it's a very efficient, excellent choice. The Graviton Cannon, very expensive, unfortunately. It's mostly worse than the Gravis Las Cannon for hunting vehicles. It does do quite consistent damage because of the Grav, but the Las Cannon's probably going to be better most of the time, and a little bit cheaper. It's also competing with the Neutron Blaster now as well, which we'll talk about in a minute. The one thing that it does do that is, obviously the las cannon Neutron Blaster don't do is it's got a very big template, and Grav templates, fantastic. I can tell you from playing lots of Iron Hands with lots of Grav. Grav wins games, and you can't underestimate the effect of dropping big templates all over the place. So if you've got no other Grav in your army, or maybe you have and you want to get lots of it, this is definitely a viable option for doing that. It's not going to be as good at killing things. It can. It's nice having Haywire. It always is. But I would probably think of this more as an area denial weapon than anything else. Now, this has been FAQ'd clearly since last time I did a Predator review, and these Grav weapons are no longer defensive weapons. Boo. I enjoyed this being a defensive weapon, but it isn't anymore. But the Volkite Macro Saker as well. So 8 shots of Volkite. And unfortunately, like most big Volkite guns, just not really very good. Very expensive for what it does compared to this, not a significant upgrade over the smaller Volkite weapons, which is weird because it's such a big gun. Compared to all the other ways you've got to kill an infantry, not that great. It can defensive fire though. You could pair it with las cannon Sponson, so it can shoot at some infantry and the las cannon can shoot at a tank or something like that. So it's not, terrible. If you are one of those people who loves Tomb tanks with lots of Volkite, fire away, looks cool, makes a cool noise, well, you make the cool noise. And, there's nothing wrong with that. Just a little bit on the weaker side and could have done with being probably just cheaper and, maybe a couple more shots and a little bit cheaper to make it a bit more attractive. Next, we got the Neutron Blaster. Now, I really like the Neutron Blaster. It's expensive. It's 5 more points than a Gravis Las Cannon, 35 points, which is a lot. And it's quite different in profile. So it's Strength 10. It's still got Sunder, and it's AP 1. So it's only 1 shot compared to the Gravis Las Cannons, but it's a Strength extra and is more likely to explode things when it pens. Now, what that means is basically it's better against Armor 15 because, Las Cannons, despite being great, are only ever going to chip hull points off and not penetrate Armor 15 things, whereas this has got a good chance, particularly if it goes through, it's got Sunder, of actually killing something that's Armor 15. And those vehicles are not that uncommon. You've got the Spartan, you've also got things like the Triaros Armored Conveyor now as well, that's popping up. And, even so, when you do penetrate, even though the Las Cannon's got extra shots, the extra +1 from AP1 has a big effect on, how real terms affect. We often think about, anytime a vehicle gets penned, it's dead, and we all know that's not what really happens all the time. So that extra +1 really makes a difference how often you do kill vehicles. Other things are different. It's got a much shorter range at 24 inches, which is a little bit on the short side. You may occasionally not be able to target things, particularly if they're sitting back. And it gets hot, which is a minor disadvantage on vehicles, in my opinion. But it is still a disadvantage nonetheless. But it is concussive, which is quite good in some situations. It's not the most reliable thing in the world, but if you've got nothing big to shoot at, putting a big concuss on a big assault unit, just having a go, and if it goes off, you can really have a big swingy thing that happens there. But the big thing that this has is Shock Pulse. Shock Pulse is an absolutely incredible ability. All you have to do is penetrate, which against a lot of very big expensive targets like Knights, other super heavies that people use, a lot of them are actually less armor than things like a Spartan. A lot of them are only armor 14 or maybe even 13, which this has got no problem penetrating. It means they can only fire snapshots next turn, and that's very, very good. Effectively, you shoot with it. If it hits and pens, which it's going to be reasonably good at, you're effectively taking that unit out the game for a turn in terms of its shooting, and that frees up all your other firepower that you might have wanted to focus on that unit to focus on something else. Shock Pulse is a very, very good ability, and I think it's probably undervalued by a lot of people. So ultimately, this is an interesting alternative to a Gravis Las Cannon, I think. It is quite expensive, but Shock Pulse is pretty hard to put a value on, and I do think that this is a really cool thing to run. It's an alternative to Gravis Las Cannons or the Melter or, things you would normally take just to try and blow stuff up. You can Shock Pulse things away, and maybe you'll kill them anyway with your big gun. It's still a big gun, but you've got the Shock Pulse there too, and an interesting option to maybe try and concuss some enemy assault units sometimes. I really like this. It's really cool. Definitely brings some interest and variety to the big guns in your army, and Neutron Blasters aren't that commonly available either. There's not that many ways to get them into your list. The Gravis Las Cannon is the last turret option, so classic, solid choice, gives you 2 Las Cannon shots, 30 points, which is a bit on the expensive side for a vehicle as soft as a Predator, but, it's still viable, especially since you can bring 2 more Las Cannons with it as well for a nice gun, mobile, 4 Las Cannons that can, put the hurt on pretty much anything. Good solid choice, always looks cool in that classic Predator Annihilator loadout, and you can't go wrong taking Gravis Las Cannons. Onto the Sponsons now, so these have not changed with the release of the Predator support kit. So Heavy Bolter, cheap and cheerful. It can fire at infantry if your main weapon's anti-tank. It's good as a cheap option, particularly for Imperial Fist, who are getting +1 to hit with it. Well, it can be some super light anti-tank in Iron Warriors, I guess. You shoot Rhinos or something, knock hull points off them. These have gone up a little bit in value because, again, there are more AP Armor 4 things in the game now for them to shoot, but not a huge deal. So you're going to take the Heavy Bolters a lot of the time if you just don't want to spend any more points on the tank. Alternatively, you can take Heavy Flamers, which I would prefer. So they're a free upgrade. They're not really usable in the range you want tanks to stay at most of the time, but they are a defensive weapon. If you don't value your Heavy Bolters particularly, you could argue that Heavy Bolters are kind of pointless because they do so little damage, and I don't think you would be super wrong to say that. Heavy Flamers give you a defensive option. They are good for clearing out some of these chaff things like Auxilia, some Mechanicum units. And in Salamanders and Death Guard, when you turn them into Dragon's Breath or Alchem, Heavy Flamers, they do get quite a lot better because they're normally wounded on 1 better. Salamanders ones have got the extra wall of death hits as well. So Heavy Flamers, I think, given just the changes to the game, are a little bit better than they were, and I would normally favour them over heavy bolters outside of Imperial Fists. Then we got the las cannons. So these are strangely cheap on the Predator. 10 points for 2 las cannons. Upgrading over heavy bolters or heavy flamers is just kind of auto take, really. I would have liked to see the Predator a little bit cheaper and this upgrade a little bit more expensive is probably the way I would have balanced this tank and made it just a little bit better, maybe by 5 or 10 points. But anyway, it's tough not to take these on almost every Predator loadout because they're 10 points. You know, compared to Volkite as an upgrade, which is 10 points we'll talk about in a second, you're more likely to kill a Space Marine with 1 las cannon shot than you are with a few Volkite shots, and obviously it's also great against tanks and dreadnoughts and everything else, so pretty much you're always going to take these unless you've got an aesthetic or narrative reason for not doing so because they're so cheap. And then you got the Volkite Culverins as well. Now these are in a bad spot because they're the same cost as the las cannons. They are quite a big anti-infantry upgrade over the heavy bolters, and they can fire at infantry if the main weapon's anti-tank, and obviously if you want to make the Tomb tank build as well, you know, that's pretty good. They are a good weapon, and they are worth 10 points over the heavy bolters. They're just not really worth taking out when you could have 2 las cannons most of the time. But again, for narrative reasons, or you want to, you know, make a tank that can sort of multi-roll, there's nothing wrong with these at all if you're not optimizing the tank. And finally, the Pintle Weapons. I love Pintle Weapons. They're so cool. They just look great on the tank. I wish they were a little bit more viable than they are. So the multi-melter, I've changed my mind on this since I last reviewed the Predator. I think it's too expensive now. There's really never a loadout where you want to pay a whole extra 20 points for a tank that's kind of soft to get this extra firepower in. Mostly not worth it, in my opinion. But, you know, if you like multi-melters, or if you want to do some kind of crazy melter tank with a Magna melter and a multi-melter on top as well, you know, maybe not a terrible option. You know, multi-melters are really good. Also, if your tank's already very cheap, like if you're playing Imperial Fists and you're taking the vanilla loadout, you know, for 120 points, another 20 for a multi-melter still keeps it reasonably costed. So they are definitely usable. And, you know, if you like multi-melters, I really like melter weapons. Not a terrible thing to put on the tank, just maybe not optimal in terms of points. Heavy bolter on top, cheap. Heavy bolter's not very good, but for the legions that do buff them, so Iron Warriors, turning them into, you know, a shrapnel option, just letting you shoot that tank at that weapon at a random target to try and pin it, particularly if you haven't got any other shrapnel weapons on the tank, is really good. Auto-include upgrade, effectively. And Imperial Fists, if you just want to make a tank with as many shots as possible, +1 to hit, again, it can be usable. Heavy Flamer, similarly. Now, I do actually quite like these now. For 5 points, it's not a bad throw-in. Now, when you come to the end of an army, sometimes you have 5 points, and this is a pretty good way to spend it. I think it's a defensive weapon. It does clear chaff infantry on the odd occasion you do play against those Auxilia or something. It can easily just destroy most of a squad and make them take a morale test and run away, which is great for 5 points. If your vehicle does happen to already be a Flamer Predator, you know, more Flamers is definitely the one where you want to go. And again, Salamanders and Death Guard get more benefit out of heavy Flamers than other legions as well. So certainly worth considering most of the time if you've got spare 5 points, and for some builds, definitely worth using. The Predator does also have some equipment options as well, so Hunter-Killer Missile is very common on vehicles, generally just not very good. 5 points for the one-shot, weak stats, not excellent. I am a big fan, though, of putting these on the tank for aesthetics. I think having the missile on top of the tank looks really cool, and I think if you can, I guess, get away with that, or if it doesn't bother your opponents too much, maybe magnetize it for people who it does. Definitely a thing that I really like just for aesthetic value. If you're going to spend an extra 5 points of sort of throw-in points, probably better spent on a Pintle Heavy Flamer or a Dozer Blade or a Searchlight, anything but this, really. Speaking of Searchlights, always good to have in your army. Every army that's focused on shooting should have Searchlights wherever it can get them, really. Better on things like Rhinos or tougher targets, you know, won't necessarily die, but if you've got nowhere better to put them, it's a nice to have option to put them on the Predator. And again, they look cool on the model. And then lastly, there's a Dozer Blade. Again, nice to have thing for vehicles in general. Vehicles do have to go through a lot of terrain, particularly to get optimal fire angles or to get where they want to go with their movement, etc. So always nice to have a Dozer Blade, and worth throwing in again if you've got 5 points spare on shorter range tanks like a Flamer laden tank, or even potentially like a neutron blaster where you're trying to get angles with the short range gun. this does go up in value a bit as well. So all these worth considering. None of them an auto-include by any means in any vehicle, but always something you can add to your loadout if you've got the points to spare. So the general loadout considerations I would think about when building your Predator: don't make it too expensive. Remember, it isn't that tough. They're easy to kill. About 150 points is about as high as I'd go to consider optimal. If you're trying to really optimize this tank, you can get away with 160 or so, and that's how much some loadouts cost, so that's okay. But what I certainly wouldn't do is load the tank up with everything and multi-melters, and other things as well. Do build a loadout for shooting a specific target type, ideally. Do make sure you've got some focus or multiple focuses, know what the role of your tank is going in, because it can mix and match targets a little bit, thanks to the way sponsons work with angle in your tank, and also thanks to defensive fire being able to pick a secondary target. But, do have that role in mind. Defensive fire and angle in your sponsons do have some restrictions though as well. So, don't expect that you're always going to get optimal splitting your fire when you do this. I'm not suggesting that. It's just a way to improve the efficiency of your tank. And, if you play it properly, position it well, you maybe get some optimal shooting out of it. And all the loadouts I'm about to talk about as well do get 15 points cheaper in a squadron. So your second Predator is only 105 points, which is a pretty big discount. It's more than 10% off the cost of the tank. And if Predators were 105 points in general, they'd be very good. Don't make squadrons too big though. I like running these either in 1s or 2s, because they become too susceptible to larger units. Like an enemy 10-man las cannon squad shooting a single Predator is going to overkill it. And you're not going to be super sad if that squad, which is in the mid 250-ish points range, shoots all the shots at a single Predator. But if it shoots at a Predator squadron and it can see the whole squadron, it's got a good chance of killing multiple Predators. So just be careful about stacking up your squadrons too big, if you've got lots of those, enemy units with lots of firepower around. Things like Land Raiders can do it as well. So just, although we can get that points discount, it does make the unit a bit more unwieldy. So what loadouts would I recommend? Well, first, a couple of what I would call the power loadouts, the really optimized ones for people who just want the best Predator they can manage. The classic Predator Destructor, autocannon on the top, 2 las cannons on the side, I think is really good. And this is mostly because it brings great firepower whilst also keeping the tank cheap. 130 points is very cheap for what this brings. And if your opponent is blowing these up, by the dozen all over the table, you don't really care because they're so cheap. 2 of these is going to run you 245 points. That's an excellent unit. The second power loadout is the Magnum Melter Cannon and 2 las cannons. Now, the Magnum Melter Cannon, easily the most efficient turret option in terms of bang for your buck, and obviously those Sponson las cannons as well. It's a lot of firepower. 5 very big shots coming out of that tank with Sunder. Easy to get armor bane. Good for shooting at elite infantry like Terminators, things like Custodies as well. Good for damaging them, and obviously good for hurting big targets too. These loadouts are very optimal in terms of points. But there are other good options as well. Those first 2 loadouts, very optimized, but the slightly less optimized loadouts are still very good. It's not to take anything away from these at all. The Predator Annihilator Classic with the Gravis las cannon, 2 las cannons on the side. A little bit expensive at 160 points, but again, great firepower. Now, that the Magnum Melter Cannon definitely pips this a little bit, just by being 10 points cheaper and having the extra shot. But the las cannons are a bit better against some targets. They are longer ranged as well. And this is a great looking tank, a classic tank, and it does a good job. Alternatively, there's the Neutron Blaster and 2 las cannons tank as well. Now, it's 5 points again, but as I talked about before, Shock Pulse can really nullify huge enemy vehicles, and you do see more, Knights nowadays. You do see the odd Super Heavy and that kind of thing around as well. So you can allocate, less firepower to them by shooting this at them. Everyone else can shoot something else and you've still neutralized it. And it's something a bit different as well. Rather than just loads of big guns, shock pulse and things to neutralize them is really cool. I do like the Plasma Destroyer as well. I would run the Heavy Flamers with it because I think they're better than Heavy Bolters, but up to you. Good anti-marine platform, good alternative to the Scorpius, a little bit less maybe obnoxious than the Scorpius if you're playing slightly less high-powered games. The Scorpius can be quite feels bad sometimes, although taking one of them in your army is not a terrible thing. But anyway, I digress. good alternative to that. A little bit more accurate, good to kill Marines. Definitely a viable choice. And again, looks cool. So many of these Predator turrets just look cool, and it's great having all these different options, and particularly if you're going to play an armoured spearhead or you're going to run like multiple Predators, it's great to have them all doing similar roles, but not spamming the same loadout to keep your army interesting. There's some Legion-specific loadouts as well. So Salamanders or Death Guard, the all-flamer tank. So Flamestorm Cannon, 2 heavy flamers and a Pintle heavy flamer. It's only 140 points for 4 big templates. I do like this, and even outside of these 2 legions, I think this is more than viable in other legions as well. It makes it much scarier for enemies to approach you for melee, because as they get closer, this strikes out, and if you shoot at it's reasonably fast to position. The Flamestorm Cannon certainly is easy to get optimal shots with, and it's easy against an enemy unit of, say, 10 Marines that are trying to assault. It's easy to get 40 hits, certainly, sort of 30-ish hits range, and that will, pretty much wipe out a squad of Marines. If you're playing against things that have got less armor than Marines, like I've mentioned Auxiliary a few times, this is just going to mow armies down. And although the sort of, 200-300 Auxilia body army is a very competitive and probably something most of us will never play against, this would give them absolute nightmares. So I think it's a cool way to use the tank, certainly very fluffy for Salamanders and Death Guard as well, and a very viable and interesting loadout. Imperial Fists get away with an autocannon heavy bolters, so the literal vanilla Predator tank, +1 to hit on all its guns, pretty decent firepower out of the autocannon. That's pretty cool, really. Alternatively, Imperial Fists, you can just run the Predator Destructor version with those las cannons, which is a bit better, but it's cool that you can run 120 point tank with effectively Ballistic Skill 5 with them. It's pretty good. Iron Warriors as well, autocannon on top, any gun you want on top really would work. Shrapnel cannons on the side, maybe a Pintle shrapnel cannon as well. That's 136 points or a bit more if you upgrade the top gun to a better gun. Excellent pinning potential, immune to the return fire of lots of targets as well. There's lots of enemy infantry units that might not have anti-tank weapons you can shoot at and pin them, and they can't even shoot you back effectively, which is a great thing to be able to do with a tank. You can also a big gun on top of this as well, so the shrapnel or defensive fire and pin something, while this can bring, a neutron blaster, or it can bring some other big gun as well, which is pretty cool. Overall, lots of good loadouts available on this tank, and there's so many ways you can mix and match all these weapons, especially when you start thinking about big gun on top, defensive weapons on the sides, legions that have got, better defensive weapon upgrades as well. It's a really cool, very customizable tank, and although there's definitely ways to optimize it in certain ways, you can actually just run lots of, if you stick to the weapons that we've talked about that are the better weapons, not the ones that are really weak, like the conversion beamer and stuff like that, you can make a lot of cool loadouts with this that will definitely do you well on the tabletop. Let's just talk a little bit about vehicle strengths and weaknesses as well. Now, people generally down on vehicles a little bit in Heresy because they can get popped very easily by, an errant las cannon shot, but that's not really the way it works on the tabletop. Vehicles do have some strength. Firstly, they're immune to small arms, completely immune to small arms, and lots of lower end weapons as well that intended for anti-infantry, and lots of melee weapons. Even things like power fists sometimes can actually, just struggle to kill vehicles. You get enough of them, it's obviously going to die, but things like power swords, power axes can all just bounce off as well. Not susceptible to blast weapons in the same way that infantry are, and there are lots of good infantry clearing blast weapons out there now. Vehicles can move and fire, which is an advantage over things like heavy support squads, and they are a little bit faster than dreadnoughts when they want to be as well. Not always firing optimally, but can be faster. And they can't be locked in combat. Dreadnoughts, duty space marines, etc. can all be locked in combat. There are benefits to being a vehicle. They do have weaknesses. Obviously, they can die in a single shot. The reality, though, is that most units aren't a single las cannon that can perfectly split fire. So if you've got one Predator and an enemy's got a dreadnought with 4 las cannons or a squad of 10 space marines with las cannons, although they've got a good chance of killing it when they shoot at it, a lot of the time they will shoot at it and it will die, and that's used up the entire unit shooting. Or sometimes you get lucky and it won't die. Particularly the dreadnoughts. Dreadnought fires 4 shots, misses 1, maybe occasionally 2, fails to penetrate with 1, and then just rolls a couple of 3s or 4s on the damage table. One of the great things about vehicles is, as much as they can pop, when they get shot like that, sometimes they actually, nothing happens. They don't even really get degraded a lot of the time, whereas other units at least lose something. So not quite as bad as it's always made out to be, vehicles exploding easily. Limited reactions is an issue, though. Not being able to return fire with big guns is a big difference compared to Dreadnoughts and Space Marines, so that's certainly a weakness of vehicles. And it's hard to get cover as well. Though you can get cover with vehicles, every other unit, gets it a lot better, really. So definitely some strengths to using vehicles, and you should bear those in mind when you're comparing this to other ways of getting guns into your army. And I think it's also worth pointing out at this point as well that variety is a strength of vehicles as well. It's a narrative strength, but we're not always fully optimizing our armies, and sometimes we're just looking for ways to make the army look cooler, give us a different model to paint, and the Predator certainly helps with that versus the more competitive options as well. For tactics when using the Predator, just a few things to bear in mind. The Predator is a light tank, not a main battle tank, although it's kind of suggested as being a main battle tank, it's not. Medium weapons can kill it, auto cannons can kill it, las cannons will penetrate it more often than not, etc. So it's a light tank, and so don't run it out in front of your army. Don't stick it in open ground where the whole enemy army can shoot at it unless you don't care about it dying. Keeping your Predator alive to shoot a few times is the key to making it worthwhile, really. And that might sound a little bit obvious, but you don't always need to YOLO it every turn. Sometimes shooting at a suboptimal target, if it means that, the enemy's heavy weapons can't see your Predator, or less of those heavy weapons can target your Predator, or they're suboptimally shooting at the Predator instead of something else, can be fine, or even missing a turn of shooting with the Predator, so that gives the rest of your army a chance to cut down the enemy's heavy weapons, and then your Predator can come out and be around for 3-4 more turns without taking tons of return fire. Might be a better option than just turn one, drive forward, fire, and die. Think about that when you're using it. It's not a main battle tank. Do use cover to cut down enemy fire lines where you can. Depends on the table you play. Good tables should have at least some places where you can use cover to minimize return fire from the enemy or eliminate it altogether. And if you are using a squadron as well of 2 Predators, if you've got like a big ruin or a building, you can put 1 Predator on sort of like either side of the ruin, and that means when people are shooting big units at your squadron, often they can only see 1 vehicle. So even if they do target your squadron with a big 10 las cannon heavy support squad, I'm going to keep saying that, they can only kill 1 Predator, which is quite a big deal and a really good way to get 2 Predators in your army, take advantage of that points discount with less of the disadvantages as well. Do move around with your movement as well. 7-inch movement, firing all your guns is pretty good. 14-inch movement when you want to is also great. Use that to help keep the Predator alive. And don't forget to use the Sponson and defensive weapon fire rules to split fire optimally where you can, or sometimes just to make sure you're getting shots off. Use your armor to shoot at targets with strong anti-infantry weapons as well. So vehicles are a great way to get around reactions. Like if the enemy's got a unit of Volfied Culverins, like I do in my Iron Hands, which are very powerful, shooting at them with a tank is great because they can't hurt it. Whereas if that was my Dreadnought shooting at those, I'd expect to take a couple of wounds and return fire, which is, advantage Predator there, which is quite cool. So really what I like about Predators is that there's a lot of things in Warhammer where there's not, although people will say there's not great tactics to using them. You pick the most optimal target and you fire your guns and you're done. The Predator's quite cool to play. It's got a lot of firepower, but to really get value out of it, you have to really think about what you're doing. Maybe think a few turns ahead, decide when to commit it, which makes it an interesting unit to play on the battlefield, and a reason that I really like it, as well as adding variety to your army. So in summary, the Predator is a medium price base. It's not super aggressively costed, but it's also not too expensive to use either, and it can be quite an efficient unit if you don't make it too expensive or to go too crazy with it. It has got some definite optimal loadouts due to some of the options like the Magnum Melter or the last cannon sponsons just being so well costed, but it's got lots of weapons, particularly with the release of the support kit, that are more than viable if you're not playing super competitively, and even if you are, that add different dimensions to your army that people might not be expecting, like the Neutron Blaster, which can really swing the way some games work, or the All Flamer tank, which adds something that a lot of armies don't have to deal with very often. It does look awesome, and it adds variety to the big guns in your army, particularly with some of these things like Melter Cannon or the Neutron Blaster, or just an alternative to running more Dreadnoughts or, heavy support squads and things that are maybe a little bit common. It's less susceptible to powerful anti-infantry units, which is certainly a bonus. It can't get wiped off the table by a Scorpius or by some of them Mechanicum big anti-marine blasts. And as we've just gone through in the strengths, there are other strengths of vehicles as well that do make this worthy of consideration, regardless of what power level you're playing at. On the flip side, you can also use it to power down your army. If you do consider some of the big heavy support squads or dreadnoughts to be too good, or if you're playing against an opponent with maybe a less serious army than yours, these are a good way just to make your army a little bit easier, gives your opponent something to shoot and maybe kill, while still making sure you've got the guns in your army that you want. And that's the end of the show. I hope you enjoyed it, and this is the first video after quite a big break for me, so I'm super excited to release this and have you guys listen to it and give me some feedback on it. Please do give me feedback, anything you want to give me in the comments down below. I'd love to read it all and chat to you guys. And again, please do join us in Discord. The link is down there in the video description as well below. I'll see you all soon. Thanks for listening, and bye-bye.